Hello, everyone. This is Brittany Hinojosa-Citrin. I'm an attorney here at Samuel Sayward and Baylor in Dedham, Massachusetts, where we concentrate our practice in the areas of estate planning, probate, and estate and trust administration. And this week we have a special edition of Smart Counsel for Lunch. It's one of our Smart Counsel interviews, and I'm here with Mariah Riess. Mariah, if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners and our watchers.
Well, first of all, I'm really appreciative of having this time with your listeners. I have a private practice in Dover, Massachusetts, and I have a little bit of an unusual profession. I would say for many decades, I've been a lifestyle change specialist and particularly focusing on areas of health and specifically overweight. For the last 8 years, I have really transitioned into helping people with that arc of life where illness, diagnosis, loss, and death occur. And I am a guide, I'm a thought partner, um, I am a compassionate listener, and for a profession and for really a life commitment, I hold people. I hold them through some of the most challenging times that we can experience and some of the most important times in life. And often that is around some component of a life ending.
Mm.
So my training, I'm an MSW, a clinical social worker. And I've had the great fortune of having been trained by the best in traumatic grief and loss. And I'm also an end of life doula. So I spend a lot of time being available to people who reach out to me. It's a word of mouth position I'm in, and I treat people all over the country and even in other countries. I'm
Um,
not sure that we do a great job with these areas of mortality. And in this country, people are really hard pressed for answers and counsel um, and support during these times.
Right, yeah. And you mentioned that you're an end of life doula, and honestly, that's something I had never heard of before. And I had heard it through word of mouth. So, if you could, maybe to someone like me who had never known what an end of life doula was, could you explain that a little bit more as to what you do?
Sure. So, generically, very much like a birth doula, I help people prepare for this event. Um, and because this is kind of a new, um, it's not quite a profession, I don't think in a bona fide way, but it's not unusual that I will be called to a situation where people are really confronting the end of life. One example I might give is I received a call from the husband of a woman who had stage 4 breast cancer. She had
Mhm.
gone through extensive treatments. She was in her early 60s, and she had asked for a death doula because she was told there was no more that could be made available for her. I traveled to the home, and this is a deep calling for me, and I have a enormous set of skills and toolbox. So when I walk into a home or their beautiful home, I can feel immediately a direction I need to go in. And this was a woman who was fighting to stay alive. The moment I saw her, I could read where we were going. And I knew right away my first job was to bring her from her top floor in their bedroom down to the first floor where the activity of the home was, and to set up a place where she would live her last days. And as a death doula, this is the subject. These are the conversations we have. And so I, as a end of life doula, get to learn about what a person who's looking at end of life, what are her values? What are her priorities? I get to look at the social situation, perhaps in this case, in many cases, people who are not well, they're isolating. And I really got to unpack for her just all her relationships. And what we ended up doing was setting up a calendar where people came to say goodbye to her. She crossed over to that place of really getting who she was for others as an end of life doula. And of course, I can't speak for all end of life doulas. I think I've had so much training. So I have, again, this toolbox, if you will. Um, I got to be with her husband and really help him to understand what was coming next. And
Mm.
it's just amazing how it works. I have ended up somehow with timing, because I have a very busy practice. The homes I've been in the last 2 years, I've actually been there when the person is passing. So I get to help them transition. I get to help guide the family through what's happening. And often I'm interviewing hospice, or I'm even contacting a funeral home, making decisions with the family on what to do. If I haven't known them for very long, it's kind of imminent, and we do that together. So
Mm.
I think that the role of end of life doula is extremely powerful. It's different than my role as a grief specialist.
Mm.
End of life doula, I tend to be very engaged with the medical team and what's happening, and really helping people go to that end of life. Um, and to do that
Right.
with a beauty and a grace that is just unbelievable, certainly for me.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned you also do grief counseling and you're a grief specialist, so I assume that you talk to the families and you help them through their grief as well.
Yes, and though traditionally end of life doulas are not trained in grief support, but
Mm.
I am. I just before this call, I was with a gentleman, and I actually helped his wife to her final resting place, and I've been working with him now for the last year to just adapt and to experience his grief. And one of the things that happens when people have a loss is it reminds them of other losses. So today he brought in, one of his assignments was to bring in an item for clothing, and also to bring his beloved dad's tie clip in.
Oh.
And I got to hear stories of his dad while he held that clip, and stories of his
Mhm.
wife while he held her her shirt. And when he was leaving, he looked at my dog and he said to my little dog, he said, "We have had a very good session today."
That's so
So it's
sweet.
something that's so gut-wrenching and so sad. He is really learning how to adapt to this new life and this loss. And there's a lot of beauty that we're actually bringing in within just the unbearable grief he's also had.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think that's a connection that you and I have is that we both talk about death every day. And we both help people, whether that's me legally helping them or you helping them emotionally, which, may just as be, if not more important than what we do. But it's an aspect that a lot of people don't talk about.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons I was very happy for us to speak today, because I think it's 37% of people have wills and have done estate planning. And I have been on the other side when the wishes of a person passing have not been clear. And, I met with a woman, she was very upset, and it was in a different professional meeting on a board that I'm on. And afterwards she said, "Could I talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." I said, "You seem so upset today. What's going on?" She said, "My son is trying to get me to show him my will, and it's not his business." And she was very
Mm.
defensive. Listen to her a few ways. And I said to her, "Do you have a will?" "No." She said,
Mm.
and a long story short, because I know we don't have much time today, I told her I was her girl, that I would hook her up, and this was something she could do to take care of her family, et cetera, et cetera. And long and short of it, there was a story behind the story that was really heartbreaking for her. She had been married
Yeah.
another time, and her family thought she was divorced from the second man, and she wasn't, and she had never told them, and it was
Oh
holding
my
up the
gosh.
estate planning process. And do you know, we got that will done, and it was her family, they knew how much relief there was for the whole system to get that done. And
Sure.
I have these events here in my home where very often this is so surprising in one way, but not at all. It's really hard to think about all that you've worked for and how you want to leave it, and that you're leaving, and all those decisions that go through there. And that's just another way I think you and I really share some really important combined skills where to
Mhm.
do those initial conversations, maybe it'd be harder to do in an attorney's office because it's so confronting. So to
Yeah,
have those conversations and then go into the hands of you where you can get it done and the relief
right.
is just horrible.
Yeah, right. Because that could actually be an issue because sometimes people are intimidated when they come to our office because they're speaking with an attorney and all that. And I try to make people feel as comfortable as possible. Like I'm not a big bad wolf or anything. But yeah, I mean, on top of the stress of having to think about your mortality and how you want to handle that and what you want to do is a lot. So
Yes,
it can be very stressful.
I wrote down this little saying when I was thinking about being on this call because I wanted to be succinct. And there's a wonderful author, Barbara Lee Coombs, who started a group called Compassion and Choices. And she says, we must be willing to accept, though everything might be fine now, eventually it won't be. And I thought that was really well said, you know?
Yeah. Yes, it's very true. So talking about your end of life doula practice, I understand that there's phases to your practice and how you speak with your clients. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So segmenting the work to legacy work, um, and then the active process of dying, and then regrouping. Okay, so each of those are ways to think about ways to address this idea of mortality or life ending, particularly in the face of a diagnosis or some kind of sign that it's time to think this way. Legacy can be done at any time, and sometimes I did some legacy work today with the tie clip and the
Mhm.
clothing, but very often legacy is to take the time and the space to be with the person whose life is ending and really look at what has this life been about. I
Mhm.
have had cases where with an elderly couple who I was called in to work with, we took a piece of wrapping paper and I unrolled it and did the opposite side of the decorative side and I taped it up on the wall in the kitchen. And with this couple, and then with the family joined in, we did a timeline of their lives because they had dementia. They couldn't process really well. But it was, when did you first meet? And I bought stickers so they could pick stickers to when you first met. And what
Mhm.
was that like? And the two of them sort of relived it together. And then
Oh,
when they bought the house, and then so that family has a whole piece that was about 8 feet long that
oh,
rolls up like a wrapping paper that their parents did through a series of a couple of weeks, and people would keep adding to it and do little jokes and so forth. That's legacy work. I
yeah.
have another couple where I helped the family, and I even did this for a woman with her horse, if you can believe, of course, because people love their pets. We
Yeah.
took all the photos and we scanned them in, and then I did a slideshow. And the slide goes right on a laptop, and it can go, and often elderly people, they'll watch the slideshow of their life and then it'll play again, but they don't remember they've seen it. And it's kind of the
Yeah.
gift that never stops giving. And I'll
Right.
just another story. I was doing a legacy project with a woman and for her mother, her 90 something year old mother's birthday. And she brought in all these photos in bags. There were maybe 4 or 5 kids in the family. And I said, well, tell me about your family. And I like to kind of then imagine the chapters and we put this together. And we were talking and she said, but there's someone who's not here, and it's my brother. And I said, well, tell me about your brother. And the story was he was in a car in high school with 3 other kids, and he crashed the car and they all died. And I just kept having her talk about him and talk about him. And the family was just so horrified by this whole, every element of this, that over the years, he began to disappear from the family.
Mm.
You know, the next day on my porch, in a bag, were all the photos of the brother.
Oh,
She brought them, and he was
oh,
just into the legacy project. And this woman, this is now 10 years ago that this happened, about 9 or 10 years ago. I got a message maybe 5 months ago that they just had the mother's 100th birthday, and they
wow.
showed the slideshow yet again.
Wow. That's
Legacy work,
amazing.
and that's just a small example. Legacy work is just a revisit and how did I get here and who am I and what's made me who I am? And it's a gorgeous way to do work. And you can do it with people at any stage. We just have to sometimes be a little bit creative if they're not processing fully.
Right, right. And probably estate planning falls into legacy work as well, because you want to preserve your legacy, whether that might be the home that you bought and you wanted to go to your children, or, the money that you've worked so hard for, going to them. So I think that's a little bit of part of that as well.
Most definitely too, because often with legacy work, you see also the breakdowns in relationships, because
Yeah,
that's families, as you well know, as well as the wonderfulness and the love, there's incompatibilities and breakdowns and conflict. And when you do legacy work, you can sometimes can work out the conflict so that it kind of doesn't absorb everything. And then when you go to do a legacy, go do your estate planning, things aren't just not as red hot. That conflict in that relationship isn't as red hot. Oh, I'm not leaving him anything, or this is what he, and that whole story of what happens it's not resolved. So legacy work can provide a lot of resolution so that the more, academic, logistical, operational components of what you do can just move forward.
right. Yeah, definitely. And then you mentioned there's a second phase, holding
Yes,
space.
and that's a little more like what I described with that client with the where I went to their home, but it could be just, being at a bedside and coordinating, with hospice. I often move people to hospice. They do better in hospice than hospital. I'm very strong on that. That's a different subject.
Mhm.
Uh, and that whole active dying piece is, it really to be guided through that by someone who's not family can make the difference between being present with the people that you see passing, your friend, your lover, your parent, and really having a completion on that. But active dying it's hard to die. It's
Yeah,
hard to die, and it's really hard for people to know what's next. And often medicine is at hand's length when a person is no longer being medicalized. And that's where hospice comes in, and you to coordinate with a hospice team is incredible. Just even making the dying experience peaceful. There's medications hospice can use and others can't. Like there's a world of information around how to do that. So that
right,
piece is very powerful. It's very soft. It's very engaging for me. And it's my goal is to really be this calming presence and truly guiding through the experience.
right,
The third piece is really wrap up. And again, I'm a specialist in grief. So I tend to have people tend to stay with me after that. Generally, even the first year, it's such a year of firsts. Um, and that is a time where oh, I could never use the term accurately to say recovery, but there's a feeling that you've to recover from something because often people have been caregiving. People have
right.
been 24/7. They're exhausted. They can't find the
Yes.
balance. Spinning. If I've gotten in there early enough, I can really shrink that experience down.
Mm.
But if I have someone who, has I've just come into the case more toward the end, um, there is a lot of reprocessing to do and framing and encouraging and directing and listening. And even then you could do a legacy project then. It's not
Yeah.
like it necessarily took place in the beginning of something. So in grief and loss, right now I've got several women who have husbands who have Parkinson's, stroke, dementia, in their home and their caregiving. And these women, several of them have care teams. It doesn't matter. That person is in the house, sleep interruption, just grieving what's changing, what's being lost. All of that hangs under that heading of grief work and being specialized in all the elements of that.
Right. Yeah. And I think those two phases are very important for the person who is dying, but also for the family to just have that time with them. And of course, I get clients every now and then who are at the end of life and they don't have an estate plan in place or anything. And of course, I'm obviously willing to help. Like I want to get that in place for them. But at the same time, it breaks my heart because I just think about them and it's like, you're going through this process and you're preoccupied with having to get all the legal stuff done, finding where all the assets are and doing all these things. And it breaks my heart because you want them to focus on, being with their family member and processing that. And, I think that's where the legacy work is very important, to just have that done and, have it in place so that you can have that time with your family member. And I think it also even interrupts the grieving process because you're grieving the loss of your loved one, and then on top of that oh, I have this will or I have this trust, and now what do I do with it, and how do I access the bank account? And it's just
Yes,
so many things at once that
yes,
it's just very overwhelming for people.
yes. And when we haven't really spoken of this, but many people are trained and acculturated to believe that medicine will save your life. And in some cases it does, but there's a point on that arc of life where if you don't have an end of life plan and you haven't had certain conversations and decisions, your quality of life will be completely compromised while your life is extended. And lifespan is what people often think about, but they're not looking at health span. And there are real facts of health span. And it can be a game of chess. It's just how you're going to get there. And my job is I have two brain scans on my desk right now because people have gotten them and they don't really understand what they mean. And they're, being told that they could have another procedure or another. It's very difficult for physicians who are in the business of saving lives to tell people that their lives are very, very going to be very compromised with this treatment and to have full knowledge. So that's just another component of discussion before you're sick, to be talking about all that goes around the documents that you do, which is your healthcare proxy, your power of attorney. And that changes. Who's going to be at one point won't be the right person at another point. I had a case where the husband had the power of attorney in his wife's healthcare proxy, and she did not want extraordinary measures. But it had not been shared with the family. And she's had a brain bleed, and he overrode her wishes. And she ended up in a bed for a year and then never recovering ever. And when the family found out afterwards, it was really crisis time for that family because they saw their mom suffering and he just couldn't part with her. And understandable, but maybe if there had been other conversations and it had been more of a family affair to understand all of this,
Mhm.
could have been just a whole catastrophe in this family avoided. So
Yeah.
again, just another little note that I wrote to myself for our call here is, and this is from, it's Atal Gawande, who wrote a beautiful book called Being Mortal that I highly recommend. We can't control the cards we're dealt, we can control how we play them. I
Wow. Yeah.
Then an honest examination of the experience of aging and a view for how to live successfully to the end allows for a fate that otherwise might be controlled by the imperatives of medicine, technology, and strangers. And when I have these conversations within often a difficult subject or a sad subject or evocative subject, we get to shine a light. And you get to do the same thing. And with the conversations in combination with your skills and your expertise, it could just make a really challenging time be so different.
So how would you recommend that someone be able to confront the mortality? I mean, because we get clients that the first step they take is making the appointment with us and meeting us, which is great. But they're definitely hard conversations. They're not easy things to talk about. So how can this conversation around legacy work be facilitated between family members?
I think I would say there's a book.
Yeah.
Gawande's book, Being Mortal, is
Yeah,
beautifully done. It was a bestseller. He's a Boston-based doctor. It's beautifully done. And it's not a threatening book to read at all. Um, so I would say that is number one. Um, and then there are even some tools that I could share with you at another time that you could recommend that your people look at and
sure.
maybe some Q&A so that they're just toe touching on the subject and kind of, yeah, I think there's some tools. There's some excellent tools. I had a gentleman who contacted me. He was diagnosed with a very serious a pancreatic cancer. He caught it early. He was, he could have lived a few months, but he went through treatment. And when he contacted me, he really wanted to talk about end of life. And I worked with he and his wife for quite some time. And he ended up picking the hospice he would go to, volunteering at that hospice.
Oh,
And I used a tool with them that I didn't design, but it walked him through all the different parts of his estate planning and so forth, and just some very real questions. It made it so much easier for him to, in his case, change his will, have his family conversations. And by the way, he's now in year 6 since those conversations.
wow. Yeah.
I'm on sailboat. Yeah,
Yeah.
refers people to me actually of all
Oh,
sorts about these subjects. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But
That's
that
it's
that
really amazing. Yeah.
so that would be one way for sure. Um, and I
Mm.
can even give you some other resources, which we can talk about at another time that you could even develop a little list for people to pick.
Yeah, sure, sure. And so just kind of on this topic of confronting mortality and having these conversations, and you even mentioned it earlier that you have people in your home. And I know when we first talked, you talked about a death cafe, and I was a little taken aback because I was like, what?
Heck,
What is
very
that?
frontal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm very much an advocate of education in this area. Yeah, so Death Cafe started in 2011 in England by a gentleman who was really running into the fact that people didn't want to talk about death, basically. And he developed a format and a platform where you can actually have, you don't have to be a professional, but you can have in your home what's called a Death Cafe. And they were doing it in cafes with cookies and tea. Okay.
Mhm.
I've had
Real
10 of them.
cafes.
Yes. I've had them in my home. I've had
Yeah.
10 of them. And
Uh-huh.
what we do is there have been, it's in 93 countries now. There have
Wow.
been over 20,000 held worldwide. There's a website.
Wow. Yeah.
So I invite people to come to just have a free form discussion about death. And it goes in all kinds of directions from medical aid and dying to estate planning to what's going on with my mother. And everybody loves them. The only thing I ask for people to do is write a reflection. And if I ever read you the reflections, people were nervous coming. It was the most positive night, blah, blah. And I love, love, love doing them. And then from doing Death Cafe, because there were so many questions and subjects, I developed the tool I sent you, which is called the Arc of Life, which really breaks down the platform of working on your health through as early as possible in life, right through the whole set of stages and punctuation points from um, would you like to avoid a crisis? So right under would you like to avoid a crisis in the early part of the arc is legal and financial planning. Arc of Life night, we talk about that. Maybe you'll come to one.
I
Then
would
it
love
goes
to.
then it goes to management.
Mhm.
Are you asking difficult questions? That's the question under management. And that's about age-related illness, diagnosis, treatments, and decisions. And it goes on through to, right, end of life. What are your priorities and your wishes? What are your beliefs and values? And the arc is, kind of going like this downward. And then, of course, there's the final affairs and loss in the future is the last endpoint. And in those nights, we use the tool. And so people they spin the dial and they pick what they want to talk about. And I've got experts in the room who, they're experts in life and loss, and it's really quite an eventful evening.
Right. So what kind of I mean, what kind of people do you see coming to the Death Cafe? I mean, is it people that are really open about having that discussion and maybe they found you and they're like, "Oh, great, I can walk in and talk about it." Or is it mainly people who are scared of having that conversation?
It can be the whole gamut. I mean, I could say there's the woman who lost her husband who is just sort of buried the whole experience, but she's thinking about death a lot. And
Mm.
so she wanted to come. I've had young people go on the website of Death Cafe and oh, there's a Death Cafe in Dover, and they've driven out from Somerville or Cambridge to come to
Oh,
the Death
wow.
Cafe. Yeah, that's always interesting when young people come.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I've often people have aging parents who are coming,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes people are just more spiritually questing around the question of death. Where do we go? Who are we? Is there a divine being? So it's very open. And I think I developed the Arc of Life night because I found that I could guide a lot in those nights, but that's not the point of that night. The point of the night is a little more free form than that. So I kind of got both menu options going there. And there's no charge for them or anything. It's just something I love to do. But I will have 20, I've had 22 people here in an evening to do this, and
Wow.
often come back and bring friends.
Wow. Yeah. That's really great.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's definitely amazing the work that you do. And I was glad I was introduced to you. Because like I said, I didn't know your profession existed, but I think it's vital for people who are coming to the end of life because that's scary. I mean, just to be literal and to be blunt, I mean, it's a scary experience. No one, you don't think about dying. And when you're confronted with maybe a diagnosis or something tragic, it's hard.
I think I do hear that often. I had no idea someone like you exists. And quite honestly, if you asked me, 15 years ago, what I would be doing for my career, I'd be treating lifestyle change across the country and the world, right? I didn't know someone like me exists, but I do feel all the pieces of my life have led me here. Some of my greatest teachers were, I've lost 7 people in my life that are really, really, really close to me, and I was
Mm.
very involved in with each of them in some of the ways we are talking about, and um, all the different areas of training, that I've pulled from, as well as those experiences have left me being me. And I have to say, every day I get up and I was just like, oh, who's going to call today? And I'm so excited for my day because I know that something's going to happen with us that wouldn't have happened if they didn't cross my doorway or pick up that phone. That's a
Yeah.
pretty extraordinary way to live, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, what is something that you would like our viewers to take away from your practice or from what you do?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the logistical, component of it, but I think it first begins with acknowledgement that we're here on this earth for so long, you know. I'm not going to take my old car and try to drive to New York, and Mike Tyson is only going to go 3 rounds well. The results, like, okay.
Yeah.
And this idea of mortality is very frightening, and to be able to actually engage in conversations about it, whether that be, there's tons of stuff online, YouTube, even watching near-death experiences. There are so many stories of people who have had near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll go through them and I'll say, okay, I want to listen to a doctor's experience, someone who is in the science, and it's very provocative in a very positive way, I think.
Yeah.
I think reading about these, you know, realities of life makes a huge difference in terms of just relating to your own mortality. And then I love, even sometimes I'll just have initial conversations with people about this, just to toe touch. And sometimes I generally work on a contract with people. So generally people purchase 4 sessions with me and then we look and review. And sometimes those sessions are staggered so that, and I might give reading assignments or materials to read. That gentleman who had the pancreatic cancer, that was how we did it because he's very academic and wanted to kind of study things. But I think
Mm,
engaging in conversations for yourself will only leave you more facile in engaging in conversations with others.
right. Yeah, for sure. And how does, the finances for an end of life doula, like are end of life doulas expensive? And how, I know you mentioned that you practice by word of mouth mainly, and you practice all over the country even. But I mean, how would one find you or another doula to work with? And back to it being like, is it an expensive thing for someone to try and have?
So I have a website. So it's mariahriess.com, and that's the best way to reach me. There are people who've gone through certain trainings. So the MISS Foundation is MISS, is a Kubler-Ross Foundation, and that is where you can find people who work well with traumatic grief, which end of life can be. That's Joanne Cacciatore's group. I love that group, and they're nationwide. Um, there are people who train to be death doulas. I can't speak to that. Um, I can't speak to that training beyond that I've done it. And I thought in the training, oh, so much more training is needed. So I think one needs to be really inquiring as to the experience of an end of life doula because it's not a 5-day training. It takes so much more to do this well. And if
Oh,
someone
yeah.
is has had hospice training and then does end of life doula training, that's your thing. But the group that I trained with is called INELDA, INELDA, and I think they do a good job with people who have additional skill sets for end of life work. That's how I would put that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mariah, for having our interview. It was really insightful, and I love hearing from you about what you do. And I really do think it's really important because I mean, what we do is very important as well. But it's a hard time in someone's life, and you know, me doing the legal documents is just kind of where we stand. I think having somebody like you to be able to talk those things through and be able to help to speak with their families and just to help them get through such a hard time is important.
I think the context that I might bring to a situation can soften some of what you need to do. And
Right.
it'd be my privilege.
Right. Yeah. And dealing with grief and everything that goes along with it. So I really appreciate you speaking with us today. And thank you everybody for watching. Mariah mentioned that she has a website, mariahreese.com, where you can find her. And
You can also look at Mariah Dover. It'll come up.
yes, yes. And
Mariah,
actually, I think that I had Googled that.
yeah, Mariah
That
Dover.
yeah.
There I am.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody next week for our next Smart Counsel for lunch.